Hollywood on a holiday Tuesday, apparently. Crazy with traffic and parking. My name is Crystal Diaz. I'm the event. Oh, thank you. I'm the community and events coordinator for LA Stage Alliance, but I'm also a member and part of the artistic and management committee here at Theater of Note. So I am extra excited for you all to be here today. Our current show, The Invisible Play, is an office comedy, so you'll see our lovely cubicles. If you didn't realize what they were, they're pretty much always that ugly. Cubicles are. But if you're interested in our show, it closes this weekend. We have shows Wednesday through Saturday. So I do hope you come back, or just come back for our marathon, our performance marathon, January 18th. 3 p.m. we start, 10-minute acts. We go to the last man standing, usually about 2 a.m., 4 a.m., who knows. So that's January 18th. And now I'd love to toss it to Terence McFarland, CEO of LA Stage Alliance, and our moderator for tonight.
Thank you to Crystal and to everyone at Theater Note for hosting us. As Crystal said, I'm CEO of LA Stage Alliance. For those of you that don't know, LA Stage Alliance is a nonprofit service organization serving the performing arts community of Greater LA. We like to say that we empower artists and engage audiences. And LA Stage Talks came about kind of through that dialogue, through that conversation. We realized that we wanted to have a public engagement series where we could have conversations that individual artists or arts organizations might not have on their own. Often arts organizations will have a talk back after a show or some sort of engagement activity where it's a one-to-one between the artist and their patrons or audience members. But we want to do something that zoomed up a little bit and look at some bigger issues that we could talk about across disciplines, across organizations, across the region, and really kind of get into it and see what might come up. We've had conversations about professionalism, we've had conversations about journalism, and tonight's topic, religion and the arts and spirituality and the arts. And we invited a number of folks to engage in that conversation. Some housekeeping rules. The bathroom is over there if you need it. Please feel free. We are recording tonight's session, so when we get, once the panelists have spoken and we get to the Q&A, I'll call on you and ask you to speak up a little bit so we can capture you on camera. We'll be posting it on our website for other audience members. Because of the traffic, we expect more folks to be coming, so they'll be joining us as we go along. But with that, I want to dive right in. You have your bios, so you've got a full kind of snapshot of our panelists. But I've asked each of them to start to give us a little bit of context of your path, how you came to your current role. And so if you could introduce yourself and if there's an affiliation to mention, and give us a little bit of a tidbit about your path. I'm going to start.
Sure. Well, my name is Dorr-Tilley, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And I have two paths that are kind of occurring simultaneously, so I'll be quick with both. I have a background in theater. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, and fell in love with theater through the Denver Center Theater Company, and had designed a whole world for myself there that involved the National Theater Conservatory, and ended up marrying an actor and moving to LA. And so when I got out here, I got involved working in production. I was a casting director for a number of years, and from that foundation was given the opportunity to work as a talent agent, and I currently own a boutique talent agency called Defining Artists Agency. So that's my side that's involved with theater and the arts. The other path evolved and emerged for me out here in LA. I had always had kind of a spiritual nature, but I definitely had a religious conversion at about the age of 30. And these two worlds started to inform each other, the spiritual world, the religious world, and what that meant when you talk about engaging an audience. What is this interplay? And I find that those worlds are very connected. So I'm also a pastor on staff at Bel Air Presbyterian Church, an associate pastor, and those are my two worlds.
Hi, I'm DiLossi. I'm the Director of Arts and Sacred Places for an organization called Partners for Sacred Places. As far as my path, I did start out, probably as a lot of people do, I started acting in college and went to grad school, and from there kind of went on a totally different path. I did the directing, stage managing, producing,
worked for 8.5 years as the Director of Programs and Services for the Theater Alliance of Greater Philadelphia. So I was like Philly's Doug Clayton, essentially, for 8.5 years. And we produced the Barrymores, and I directed them a few times, which is akin to your Ovation Awards here. Doug and I had a lot of conversations over the years. It was kind of just dumb luck or fate or predestination, whatever you want to call it, that I happened to be helping Partners for Sacred Places, which is headquartered in Philadelphia. They were starting a program. They did a market study of, they found out that artists needed space and that churches had a lot of space. But more importantly, that the artists were willing to work in the churches and that the churches were willing to host the artists. So that was kind of the more important piece. So I was helping them as I was at the Theater Alliance with congregating the theaters to go into one church. So I just happened to write an email to the president of the organization saying, what are you doing with this program? And how can I help in any way possible? By the way, here's my resume. So my path is kind of circuitous that way, and it's been a really awesome experience so far.
Hi, I'm Nikki Hevesy. I'm a freelance director-producer, and then also work in ministry and also in the nonprofit world under a group called Artists for Community Transformation. And I have a dual path as well. So I actually was majoring in theater, and right as I was getting ready to start in college, also had sort of an epiphany, life-changing experience. I was raised Jewish, came to, after studying a number of religions and search, came to believe that Jesus was Jewish and was the Messiah. So that presented kind of an issue, as you can imagine. And I found myself, on the one hand, really wanting to explore learning the Bible, learning what the scriptures taught, learning history of world religion and the church, but at the same time, love and passion for theater. So I started, I was finishing my theater degree at San Francisco State, and then I was driving across town getting a theology degree. So from a very young age, those worlds were merged. And for me, that was never really a conflict, which I guess we'll talk about this a little bit later, because, once I sort of came to faith in the Creator, I felt like we are creative beings, and that's who we are. And so it was from a very early age, I kind of merged those two things. And wound up having to translate a lot of what I believed, which manifests itself a lot in performing and writing. And so when I was very young, I went on tour around the country and performed in probably, 150, 200 churches, where we were teaching churches about the Jewish roots of Christianity through performing Passover Seders and sketches. And so that was kind of how I started merging those worlds together. I wound up in San Francisco and wound up getting hired on staff of a church to develop a repertory group, because we had about 80% people from ACT and San Francisco Ballet, and so we started creating material, and eventually I left that role and started a theater company in San Francisco. But because of the connections I had both in the Jewish community and the Christian community, wound up utilizing about 150 congregations that people who were part of our company, and we produced musicals. So that was my life there. And then I moved to LA to go to grad school, got an MFA in directing and at USC. And so for the last decade and a half or so, I've worked on a number of different projects, sometimes just mainstream projects where I'm looking to express and incorporate ideology and beliefs into that, and sometimes being hired by not-for-profits or religious organizations who want to do professional work and figuring out how to communicate those types of materials. So I work a lot translating between communities as well, so that's kind of my path.
Hi, I'm Henne. I'm the artistic director of Theater Dybbuk company. Our mission, I'll give you the mission, is we illuminate the universal human experience by creating provocative theatrical presentations based on Jewish myths, folklore, and history. And so to give you an idea of the aesthetic, it's multidisciplinary. For example, our 2012 production was called Cave, A Dance for Lilith, and it was a co-production with LA Contemporary Dance Company. And it actually used Lilith folklore and Hebrew goddess mythology to track from the creation of Israel back to Genesis and then pre-monotheistic worship. So it was a little thing. And that was in spoken word and dance. So that gives you an idea of the kind of work. I've been a theater artist for years. That's been sort of my largest path. I'm a co-literary manager at the Theater at Boston Court, and I teach playwriting around the city. And I work a lot in play development. On a personal level, I'll say that this group, in my early 20s, I considered becoming a rabbi and realized it wasn't the time for me for that. But obviously I had a deep interest and curiosity about Judaism. And a few years ago, the company's 2.5 years old, a few years ago I was actually at my sister's wedding in Jerusalem. She got married overlooking the Jaffa Gate. And I had been for years thinking of starting a company because I do a long group development process. My last 5 works have happened this way. I cast before a single word is written. And then over the course of 6 months to a year, this is a process partly borrowed from other people I've worked with, like Central Works in Berkeley, just to give them a shout out. And over the course of those months, we actually have many meetings where we talk about text and look at it and dive into it. And I'll bring in 200 to 400 pages of material for a 90-minute piece. And they'll ask me questions, and rabbis will be in the room, and designers will be in the room. So by the time we get to rehearsal, it's been fully explored. So I was in Jerusalem, and I started to notice for a little while that a lot of the ideas I was having for new works were related to Jewish history or themes. And it had been years since I'd actually really worked on anything overtly Jewish. And it took me about a year after that to sort of settle into this is what I wanted to do and dedicate my life to. And that's kind of what has happened over the past few years. And it's gone down a really interesting path. The last 2 projects have actually been collaborations with synagogues, where actually the last piece was a service. It was a 90-minute piece with 7 actors of movement theater that had liturgy happening inside of it. So how I got there was sort of through theater, interest in Judaism, leaving it be for a while and not realizing what was happening, and then being kind of hit by it once again.
I'm Rabbi Susan Goldberg. I'm a rabbi at Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Koreatown. And it's a really unique experience tonight to not have to of course, I was a dancer and choreographer and then I became a rabbi. All these things. It's a wonderful opportunity to be amongst people who have both an arts and spiritual path integrated, because I do a lot of time explaining or telling people, I'll tell you some other time. How did dancing and choreography and being a theater artist lead to the rabbinate? But that was my path, and to me they're entirely integrated. And I know we're going to get into questions tonight. So I think that's all I want to say. I'm a dancer and a theater maker. Had the opportunity of working with Teresa and others doing choreography for the theater, and continue to still get to do that when I can slip out and do that. But I'm delighted to be amongst artists and spiritual beings.
My name is Hirokazu Kosaka. I was born in the ancient capital of Japan, Kyoto. I just came back a few days ago from my home, which is 800 years old house. 800 years old is not old in Kyoto. My neighbor is 1200 years. It's a Buddhist monastery. I was raised as a Buddhist child. My practice were calligraphy and Japanese art of archery. My monastery asked me to come to America to study art. In 1966, I arrived in Los Angeles and attended Chouinard Art Institute. Chouinard Art Institute was in near MacArthur Park, where a very well-known artist was teaching there. Man Ray was one of them. I was not there when he was teaching, but many of the artists, present artists, were there. I after that, I went back to Japan to study traditional Buddhism. I came back and went to Boston Art Museum, assisted curation there. In 1983, I came to Los Angeles to Japanese American Culture and Community Center. I became artistic director there. Present time, I'm still artistic director there. It is one of the biggest culture center in America. Isamu Noguchi designed the plaza. We have 880-seat theater, 10,000 square foot of gallery space, and 5-story building, which encased very traditional arts from Japan. And I oversee that. That's pretty much what I do today.
Welcome to all of you. To dive right into it, sort of looking at the role of nonprofit arts organizations, right? Just by definition, nonprofits, please join us. Welcome. By very definition, nonprofits are dedicated to the public good. There's a social contract there. Similarities or common goals do you see between religious activities and the arts in your practice and experiences? And anyone can jump in.
Well, I mean, for my work, bringing the artists and the congregations together to talk about making a long-term sustainable home for them. And with partners, we have kind of a way that we like to work through things. We do it through asset-based community development. So we actually focus more on what you have and what you have to offer, and not so much the obstacles or the hurdles. But those are more of a perceived obstacle or hurdle. So the way that we approach this one particular program is through mission and vision alignment. So if a congregation tells me, well, our mission is to spread the word of God. Okay, that's great. How do you do that on this earthly plane? How do you express that? And really trying to get them to drill down, and to see how what they're doing and their ministries are somehow making the lives of their neighborhood more richer, and to make, to add to the fabric of the neighborhood, to enhance their community. And when you do the same thing with the artists and you drill down, they're in some ways doing the same thing. It's about enhancing someone's life, or having this shared experience like we're all having right now. We're all in the same room experiencing something together. And the worship services, it's the same idea. So getting them to kind of really talk about that, and talk about, for the artists, as soon as they say, well, what's your mission? I mean, they have it right there. And I really can't script it better. Because as soon as they start talking about their mission and how it is they approach it and what it is they hope to achieve by it, if I have a pastor or a religious leader who is hooked onto it, that's no more needs to be said. So I mean, in my mind and in my work, it's really nothing but similarities, in that the differences are not really there so much.
Go ahead.
I kind of see, I see religious communities in some ways as a petri dish for artists. And what I've observed over the years, it's really interesting, and more so, I think, in our generation, our lifetime, maybe than 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But I see, I compare sort of grad school to what I'm observing in the churches that have, or congregations that have a lot of artists, actors, performers that allow that. And I see, like when you first are in grad school and you're like working in this little black box space, and you're experimenting, and you have people telling you what you're doing wrong. And I see this a lot, especially in black churches too, in African American churches, where there's a developing of people who are gifted as singers or performers or directors, and they're given an opportunity to kind of develop and nurture and grow. So I've observed that a lot, which I think is interesting. Conversely, I think some of the not-for-profit arts organization, which is what Artists for Community Transformation is, And we do projects for the healing of the nations, things that are socially conscious. And there's an opportunity in a lot of nonprofit arts organizations if people start exploring their spirituality and what motivates them to want to give back and to want to create, and where that comes from and where the connection is to the creator. So I see them as very much kind of petri dishes that could cross over and help people grow spiritually and creatively.
There are a couple, as a theater artist primarily, the thing that occurs to me is, I mean, why do I make theater? You know, is there's transformation, there's revelation, and there's illumination, right? So I hope that those who come walk away transformed somehow from the experience, that something in their own lives is illuminated, and that there is perhaps realization or revelation around something that was not known before. And I feel like worship services, prayer services, religious experience often has the same goals and the same tactics, right? We are engaging with you in a communal way to cause these changes to occur, or to open a door to those changes occurring. So I think that the goals are very similar. Sometimes the hows differ, but overall the goals are very similar. I also can just say, this past year being dedicated to doing work with synagogues was fascinating, because for me as a theater artist, I had to look for the similarities, not the differences. I had to, because I had a job to perform. But also it made me really help to understand performance as performing a function. You know, a service performs a specific function. And sometimes as a theater artist, and I know from speaking to my colleagues and friends, that question can come up of what are we doing besides wanting to let our voices be heard, which don't get me wrong, that has a value, I'm not devaluing that. But asking about what is the communication and to what end, I had to ask that as somebody performing a service, literally. And so I think there's a real potential for overlap there.
I real quickly would add, kind of letting that question sink in, and just in my own mind kind of categorizing, how would I categorize not-for-profit organizations? And I came up, well, there's arts organizations, there's religious organizations, and there's humanitarian organizations. So what do those share? How are the arts related to humanitarianism, and how is humanitarianism related to the worship of God? God, humans, and art are largely what's being explored in not-for-profit organizations. So those all share an immanence and a transcendence. And then if you stop and think of not-for-profit, there's something larger than profit that's driving people in arts, in religion, and in the pursuit of sharing a human effort and a human goodwill. So there's a woven identity that those share.
There's also a movement afoot for a little while about the nomenclature, trying to get rid of nonprofit or not-for-profit and around for social good, right? That we are for social good organizations. Other of you have more to add on that question?
In the monastic life, no one asks questions. In the tradition of Japanese Zen archery, when I was practicing, the space itself, my father was teaching me, and he would yell to me, "Kill yourself, shoot yourself. It is about your ego. The target, when you see a target, you want to hit it. And that question and answer become a target. Once you could destroy that ego, you're able to shoot. Maybe you'll have a perfect shot. And this we call that void. I think the question and answer, when it becomes void, that oneness becomes very important. And I think that question is your answer. And I think I may come from a different space, perhaps.
Well, there's also the whole sense of community. I think none of the nonprofits really can exist without that community, and that nurtures whatever the mission or the vision is. You know, I know that's what I was referring to, being a safe space to explore and grow. And I think no matter what, like Kim, that's really a good way to divide that up into those 3 categories. But they all require community and a receptor, whether it's an audience or somebody that's being acted upon. And so we're engaging with people in all of those things, you know, whether it's an audience in the theater or you know, somebody we're going to help build a home for and a Habitat for Humanity, whatever the not-for-profit is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do feel like we're all kind of working towards the same goal. It's just our approach is a little different, and how we express it is different. You know, I always like to give the example of, you know, churches may host AA meetings or NA meetings, you know, and a theater company may be doing a play about a family that's affected by someone who's an alcoholic, or, you know, so really we're all telling the same stories and trying to express it in just different ways and try to reflect the human experience.
At times, certainly, I know, sort of thinking back to the NEA wars and sort of the religious right and sort of the tensions that can exist between those. And Susan, in your introduction, you said you personally feel that, right? Sort of talking about both of your worlds coming together. Maybe we'll start with you about, let's have a little bit of conversation around the differences or the tensions that you felt personally in this work and in the kind of the crossover between the 2 worlds.
Yeah, I think I was reflecting on that as you were just sharing about how we're trying to do the same thing, but I don't think it always feels that way to everybody. And I know, maybe just as a Jewish person or as an artist, I mean, there's a lot of theological room within Judaism to really question God and to have multiple experiences of theology. It's not a one-size-fits-all theology, which is different than other religious traditions. There is a space to wrestle, and we wrestle a lot. And so it also means there are lots of people who feel very strongly about not believing whatever it is that they're conceiving, they're not believing in. So there is a place, and certainly amongst artists in my life, in my house, who I don't know, they would go along with saying we're all trying to do the same thing, because I think that there is a tension between how it's expressed. I think certainly when we talk about worship services, for me, worship services are theatrical events. My background as a dancer and theater maker, it most definitely serve how services happen. And presence and what it means to do ritual performance, which is what a service is. But when we get into theology and are we all trying to get everybody to the same place, I think we want to be mindful of that. But then I think that's a really creative tension. I mean, I would prefer to have a room full of people who are skeptical of what I'm talking about than a room full of people who are just like, oh yeah, I'm with you 100%, because it's a much more creative space to be wrestling. And it's certainly why I have grown, coming from secular communist parents, to be more and more involved, to the point, obviously, I got involved, I'm a rabbi, that I got more drawn in, because there is this room to wrestle and to question and to allow that to lead to deeper experience. So I've done a bunch of work, Shakespeare work, theater, choreography, and so table work for me, for those, sitting around with the script and with the lexicon, and even if you're not doing Shakespeare, just table work is very much akin to what we do in Jewish tradition when we wrestle with texts. So we sit there, we look at the text, and people can say, oh wow, that makes me feel really uncomfortable, or I'm having an epiphany in this moment, or whatever it brings you to. You have commentary throughout the centuries that you're wrestling with. And so I think that one of the things that we have to be mindful is not assuming that we're all in the same place. But then for me, that leads to a kind of creative tension that the artistic experience, and for me, the kind of spiritual experience that I'm looking for has that wrestling. And that's the part that feels familiar to me about the arts world and the world that I'm in now of Jewish text and prayer and worship.
I'll add, when you bring up the NEA, I was at the University of Denver preparing to be at the National Theater Conservatory, and then at the Denver Center Theater Company was my grid. It was the early 80s, so if you want to do the math, I'm 51 years old. Just let me take that off your plate. So in the early 80s, mid 80s, and that's when I first became aware of the NEA. And I don't know if any of you remember it, there was Maplethorpe, and there was, and it was this, that's when I remember that tension of, is this art, and should the government be funding this? And this huge conversation that started happening about, it gets into the question of patronage. We live in a country that lets artists be provocative, that's one of our highest values. So how do we live in this country that has that value and yet somehow feels a resonance with what should art be doing? I don't remember who said this, but they said, good art uplifts the human spirit and bad art degrades it. And it's like, well, is there such a thing as bad art? It's very subjective. You get into very subjective questions. You fast forward, and I serve at Ronald Reagan's church, interestingly, you talk about as conservative of a religious community as you can get. In the 80s, I felt very defensive of the conservatives when I was a liberal. Now that I'm more conservative, I find myself in being centered in my theology of much more open to what is the artist trying to say. How do we put that in dialogue with what we believe? And if there is a degradation of the human spirit, how do we respond to that? Because that's also a truth. So it seems like as I've got older and jumped across a lot of political lines and social lines, that the peace of it, of being able to be at peace and to have conversations about those, we just have to lay down the combative nature and listen to each other, and there's a really rich conversation there.
And I also think, just to jump on this too, I think one of the challenges, maybe not so much in the Jewish community where we do wrestle a lot, but maybe in more of the sort of Christian or traditional church communities where you see there's a message that people are trying to get out, a message. And so then you deal with, okay, well, when you're superimposing a message into a creative work in art, then it becomes propaganda. Mm-hmm. And how do you explore and discover and let things grow? And it's funny because as I used to be very much against, bad art, message-driven art, where you're trying to get something across. And as I've gotten older and as a director and as an artist, and I see, really, there is a message in everything. Even when we try not to, but a message, who we are as a creator, for me as a director, there's a point of view that's going to come out in work. And so I think one of the challenges in merging these sort of worlds of religious communities and artists is, how do we allow that message to breathe, as opposed to turning it into propaganda? And how do we wrestle with that, where we're not imposing something, but we're letting who we are as spiritual beings, rabbis, ministers, to evolve in what we're communicating in the theater community or in our artwork. And so I think the whole, as I've looked at sort of American religious culture, I think that it's grown a lot in the last, even looking back historically, the last 50 years, the last 100 years, where there is an artist in the religious community now, and people are open to that. Just one more thing I'm thinking of really quickly. When I was very young and was working on staff of this congregation, and I was looking at all of these congregations that we were working with, and this, who were helping us with this theater company we formed, there was almost a bottleneck there, because the people who were in charge, the clergy, were afraid to turn over the mantle to the artists. And so what you had is you had a choir director or a youth drama director, or somebody who really wasn't trained or wasn't gifted, kind of being a bottleneck, and then, actors who were trained or gifted, or people would come in and they didn't want to work under that, so they would just leave. And I've noticed that in the last, especially decade, or maybe it's another, there's been a shift of releasing that control or power and saying, well, here's a voice of an actor, a director, an artist, or a designer, let's see what they can bring to the table, not being fearful of what the message is.
Yeah, and I kind of, to jump on this whole, I like this whole wrestling motif. And I certainly don't want to make any of what it sounds like, you know, what I do is like, oh, everybody's happy and they get together and it's A-okay. You know, because we could wrestle at table. It looks like my own table work for 9 months. I got one that's still going on for like a year. Like constantly coming back to the table, discussing things, things that are not pretty, artistic content, and how the congregation cannot have any control over what the artist does. And you know, at least in my work, it's very important to me that the artists retain their artistic, you know, their artistic freedom. I couch
Can you share a specific anecdote of when that, just to let's get into it, right? Like what's come up?
Sure. This will be a fun one. So there was a African American Baptist church that had a very strict no alcohol policy in the entire building, anywhere, and they had a beautiful 3,500 square foot Sunday school room with 35-foot high ceilings, and I had this dancer who does floor work and does work in the air as well. So this would be a perfect place to erect a truss, and you could do aerial work. It was wonderful. And at least once a year, this particular artist does one homoerotic dance piece a year. And there are naked bodies in just about every single one of those. And did I mention this was a Baptist church? Okay. So part of what we had to discuss was the artistic mission and what he does and how he chooses to express himself as an artist. So we had to have this discussion with the pastor and 2 of their trustees across the table, where he told them what his work included, and included one of these pieces every year. But it also included other things, and he told them about the other things that he was doing and hoping for, because he wanted his company to grow and he thought this was a good place to have it. And I thought, this is done. This is not going to happen. And they kind of, they took the information. We continued over their meeting, and then they were like, you know what, we just have to have a conversation amongst ourselves. We're like, okay, all right. So we came back the next week, and they said, you know what, you're here, you're renting from us. You know, we shouldn't have any say in what it is that you're doing, and if you're happy with what you're doing, and if that's your creative outlet, then that's what you need to do. So if anybody takes off their clothes, just shut the curtain. So that was the agreement that they came upon. And a few weeks later, during another part of the discussion, because they said no alcohol in the whole building, and the artist dancer once again was like, no, this isn't a deal breaker. But what if we could have some donor parties, you know, wine and beer, we glad hand, you know, you give them a wine, they hand you a check, things like that. And they're like, okay. And again, this is like 3 like very wonderful gentlemen. And they were like, all right, we need to discuss this. So, okay. So they went away, came back the next week, and they said, okay, what you bring in, you take out. You don't put it in our recycling bins, and don't tell the women. It's a gentleman's agreement. It's not actually in the actual lease itself, but it was something that it was one of those things where something that I was having total panic attacks over both of those particular items. I could have one more good one too if you want a really good one, and it just, I was just in shock and awe and wonder at this pastor and these 2 trustees who are older gentlemen really being accepting of this. The last thing about this, and it's really, this is such a good story. They had a welcoming housewarming party this one weekend, and they invited the pastor and the trustees and things like that. And they did have beer and wine, but they were all told about it in advance and everything. And I was there, and other members of my staff were there. And they had little mini performances by different choreographers, young emerging choreographers. And you know, some of them were like a little like racy, but it was okay. I was like, all right, this is fun. And then there was this one woman who her performance consisted, she like walked, she strutted in, and there was this scaffolding, and there was lights and thunder noises, and she went like this and this, and then, and she was wearing red heels and like a red teddy, and then she just stopped underneath the scaffolding, and then she was like pulling on this string, and I was like, oh my God, what is happening, what is happening? She was pulling on this string from between her legs, and then at the end of it, like she held it up, and it was a baby doll, and you heard like, you know, a baby, you know, laughing and giggling, and then she like let it fall to the ground, and then you heard the baby crying. And then she took her big red heel and lifted it up and went bam onto the baby doll's body and face, and then just strutted backward. That was the whole performance. And I was watching it, and a friend of mine was like maybe 5 feet behind me, and she came up to me and she was like, "You should see the look on your face." I said, "Yeah, because I'm going to be fired. That's why. This is done. This is done." And at the end of the night, the trustees went up to the artist and gave him the biggest hug and the heartiest handshake. They were like, "There's so many people here. We just couldn't believe that our space could be loved by so many more people." Again, it's just floored, and I was like, okay, maybe it doesn't matter, you know. And because in the end, those kinds of things that I was having total panic attacks about were not an issue. And it was just, you know, it was just an amazing experience, and like really talking about something like conflicts. I felt like the conflict was mostly within myself, more than, you know, these other people, and it was really just about laying the groundwork for it, and, you know, having good, open, honest communication. You know, in this case, we say it's better to ask for permission, not forgiveness. So if they know what they're getting into, they're a lot more accepting of it. So I was shocked. I was shocked. Sorry, I like that story. So clearly.
If I could offer a sort of wrestling, I'll call it healthy conflict. You know, one is the question of what is the function, and as different artists have different reasons for doing things. Is one looking to provoke, to comfort, to make feel safe, to soothe? And I think that it's the same tension that exists in performance as it does with religious ritual and religion. Is one going to have their worldview bolstered or challenged? And so I and therefore Theater Dybbuk tend to be much more interested in provoking and challenging. And I think that often people come to feel supported in a different way than perhaps, you know, there's a way to challenge in a supportive manner. And so one of the things that I've had to grapple with dealing with actual religious ritual is how to provoke, but do it in a way that is still life-affirming. And as just an artist in the theater, I don't always think about those things. You know, I just need to say what I need to say. They'll get it, you know, or not, and they'll walk out, and that's their issue. I mean, that's that kind of, I can get into that place. And the healthy conflict that has come, I think, has actually made me a better artist, because what's happened is I was constantly asked, I worked this past year a lot with the wonderful Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who's at the Beth Shalom Synagogue, and he, you know, we'd be in these development meetings, and, you know, actors are very careful with the writer. Why did you write that? I'm wondering. And I will have just brought in 30 pages, and he would go, "Aaron, cut that line, no one's gonna understand that." You know, and you can see all the actors around the room are like, I don't know what to do with it. But what was fantastic was what he was actually saying to me was, obscurity is not going to help us to communicate here. And so what I need is a clarity of purpose. You can provoke, you can move, you can challenge, but let me understand what you're doing. And it actually, I think that as an artist is a point of conflict, because I don't always think that way. And I think it is specific, possibly in this instance, to the function of religious ritual. So that's an area of conflict that I think actually helped the process.
I'm also thinking of, I worked on a project maybe about 10 years ago. I was hired to write and direct a story, I refer to it in my bio, of these two missionaries by an organization called Wycliffe Bible Translators. So I don't know if you guys know who Wycliffe are, but these are PhD linguistic people who are like by the book. Like if you change one letter, you know, they're you know, go into areas where they don't have a written language, and they use translating the Bible as a means of developing a language for the people. They have a spoken language and not a written language, and they're very by the book. So there was this incredible story that had happened with these two missionaries, American missionaries in the jungles of Panama, and I was commissioned to write and create. We did a large equity production, but it was really challenging trying to talk to the organizers and the heads of this organization, because, you know, you're taking some liberty and combining 5 characters into one and trying to create this. And so I just found the whole process of having to go from like, okay, I know there's 20 locations and there's 50 characters, it's 20 years, and having to go one step at a time into combining the characters and limiting the locations, and then finally saying, okay, we're gonna actually have to kill this kid on stage, this 14-year-old, and we know he didn't die in real life, but 10 other people died, so it's going to be representative. And it was such an interesting process watching them go from this literalism to being able to get a story told, and it had such an impact in the actual presentation of it. And so just going through that journey, I felt like it was a growing experience for the organization, because they really didn't know how to work with artists, and having them come to rehearsals and doing workshops on the language, and it was just a very interesting process.
Staying on this idea of working with artists and sort of the site or the space of this, hearing kind of, you know, the tension or the wrestling with this kind of work happening in a space. And I'm struck with the Japanese American Community Center, and you're saying that it's within the spiritual practice, it's about eliminating ego. And when we think of artists, perhaps ego might play into their role. And I'm wondering about the tension or the opportunities of it being a community cultural center. And then I'd love to hear from the rest of you about kind of your relationship with space, sacred and otherwise. But let's start with JCCC.
Well, just not the community center, but in Kyoto, there's a very famous Zen garden of 15th century called Ryoanji Temple. I was there just recently. There are only 15 rocks with just pebbles. I'm sure you know that Ryoanji, because John Cage did a piece in the early 60s with Dr. Suzuki. When you sit on the veranda, anywhere on the veranda, there are always 1 or 2 rocks behind another, and you cannot see it. And this is a crew. This veranda is very large. It's maybe about 30 meters long. The veranda, the word veranda, I remember, I thought, my mother used to tell me, go play on the veranda. And I thought it was always a Japanese word. But later, in my sutra books, veranda comes up. It's a Sanskrit word. It's about in-between space, about tension. In-between space called veranda, in particular Japanese architecture, this particular veranda is more sacred than any part of the edifice. It's an in-between space. It's not exterior or interior. It's not yes or no, but maybe. It's not black or white, but infinite shades of gray. It's called the buffer zone. This particular buffer, for example, your car, you need a bumper to protect yourself. And this is the tension where the monastery monks meditate for their own spiritual guidance. And we call this horizontal space and vertical space. And when I was studying English, I realized English language is written horizontally, but spoken vertically. Yes and no is very clear. Japanese is written vertically, but spoken horizontally. Maybe, lots of maybe, lots of gray. When you go to Japan to buy a suit, there must be 10,000 different gray suits. Because Japanese love this gray space. Maybe. You cannot say yes or no. You look at the entire culture. There's a writing of Izapon. If you look at it, it's interesting how he meticulously talk about Chinese character or Japanese language. I know about 15,000 Japanese characters. Within perhaps one word, for example, a character A is written in 3 strokes, correct? 1, 2, 3, 3 strokes. Many of the Chinese characters, like some of them I know, 64 stroke in one character. You could imagine the space between these strokes, and this is what we call that veranda. My mother served me, most of you have gone to Japanese restaurants. If you go into a high-end sushi store or chef, you ask for veranda. Do you know what part of the veranda of the fish is? You only get 2 slices, which is right on the neck. Next time you go to the sushi place, ask for veranda. They'll give you a nice area. My mother served me miso soup. Some of you have gone to better high-end Japanese restaurants. My mother too is meticulously cuisined, sensitive. The meal we eat, the last portion of service is miso soup. And it's lacquered, and the cap is on. When we all open the cap, sometimes she gasps and says, "Oh, how wonderful the veranda looked today." She's looking at the dew, the steam gathered on the other side of the lacquer cap. And this is what we call in-between space. I don't know if I asked a question or
Certainly amazing landscape, kind of an ephemeral space, which I think is very much along lines of what we're talking about. Others want to talk about space?
I think the idea, I think I would call it liminal space or transitionary space, and you know, our people are centered around our stories. We tell about who we are. We're story-based people, and all of those stories, I think most spiritual practices are trying to help you to be in the liminal space without, and to deal with the anxiety that's there in the transition. So we hear about epic events in our storytelling, or leaving the exodus of Egypt. It's sort of the epiphany, the getting there. But that happens really fast, and then the rest of it takes place wandering in the Midbar, in the wilderness. And we're wandering in the wilderness the entire rest of the Torah. And and then at the end we don't arrive anywhere. We go back to the creation of the world. And then in all year we read a little bit of the portion of the Torah to get through the whole cycle. So we have these moments of epiphany, creation of the world, the leaving, our mothers and fathers' stories, the leaving of Egypt, and then wandering. I mean, the amount of time that's taken up with the process of wandering and figuring out how to be a community is much longer than oh, I know it, I've arrived. We've left Egypt and the sea is parted and Charlton Heston has let us through. Most of it is not that moment, but it's the in-between and the journey moments. And a lot of, I think, what I feel like my role as a rabbi is to help in people's spiritual path to be at ease with the journey, at ease with the wilderness that is most of our lives, that then lead to moments of coming together and then more and more wandering. We're wandering in the moments of coming together. And we're getting into spiritual realms of space, and you're probably wanting to know about actual physical space, but I will say that is also something that's a part of our tradition, that spaces themselves are not sacred. We give them their sacredness. We create the sacredness in time. This is a lot of what we say that we do, that we create, the Rabbi Heschel says we create palaces in time. All of our things are around time, marking of days, holidays, Shabbat, these things, it's time. Now, there can be incredible edifice that we can build, but you can also like move from one storefront shul and say this is no longer a temple, we're moving it somewhere else, because it's really where the people are with our sacred books and what we do that make it sacred. Now, all of that to say that I happen to be working at a place that has the most incredible sanctuary that I have ever seen. And so if anybody ever wants to come see it, Wilshire Boulevard Temple has newly renovated this incredible sanctuary. So that is all true about Jewish people, that it's not about the space, it's about what we bring to the space that makes it sacred, and this place is beautiful. So that,
Do you want to talk a little bit about the process that the temple's going through right now?
yes, happy to. Wilshire Boulevard Temple comes from the first temple in Los Angeles. It was called Temple B'nai B'rith. It was downtown because that's all there was in LA, was downtown at that time. Then it moved to 9th and Hope, and this was 1860s. Then it moved to 9th and Hope, and then the third location, 1928-29, is Wilshire Boulevard Temple. And the temple, as many of you may or may not know, the Jewish community in Los Angeles was downtown. Central Avenue was a really important place, and then Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles, and then slowly it was a trickle and then a flood, and people left those neighborhoods, Jewish people, and moved west to West Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley. That then left places to become churches, parking lots, convenience stores that used to be temples. And a couple temples remained. I helped to bring back this Temple Beth Israel in Highland Park, Northeast LA, and then came to try and do something similar at Wilshire Boulevard Temple just this past June. And the temple is completely committed to the neighborhood of Koreatown and to this project. So Brenda Levin, who is the architect who did the Griffith Observatory and the Downtown Women's Center, that a lot of people don't know she did that, Dodger Stadium, the Wiltern Theater. She's a member of the temple, and they just did this incredible historic renovation of the building, which was, the ceiling was falling down, and committed to saying that is my sort of focus, that there are Jews again on this side of town, and committing to this neighborhood. That's phase one. Phase two is a community center that will have services like medical and dental services and food assistance for the neighborhood. That's the second phase that's being built now. And then another building coming with a mikvah, ritual bath, and other things. And part of the endeavor, and Aaron was just there, is to turn it also into a cultural arts space. So they have a 600-seat auditorium that they're looking to renovate to make it a working theater. So the idea of this space in the heart of Koreatown is to be both temple and community and cultural center. And they've really invested a tremendous amount of money from folks who don't even live in the neighborhood. So it's a sort of investment in the neighborhood and this sort of future, and that's what's happening at that temple. And I would say, I say this all the time, but I mean it, if you want to come, you're well, I'm Rabbi Susan, just say, remember you invited me, and I'm happy to show you around this space.
Staying on the space piece, Karen, I'm going to push on the spot and say, given your work in sort of managing these relationships and sort of these site-based relationships, what have been some of the biggest lessons that you've learned, that you've shared with folks as they consider coming into partnership?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I absolutely, I refuse to do like any kind of negotiations or deals or anything if I don't have the religious leader in the room. As well, if I don't have the artistic director or the artistic leader in the room, there's really no point.
The alternatives being the administrative staff?
Administrative
Sure.
staff, yes, or the lay leaders, because communication isn't always there, as sharp and as clear as it should be or could be. And I've had conversations break down and misunderstandings come across. So it's definitely something that, and besides, it's like, it's showing a commitment, you know, it's like, I'm committing to this relationship, this bond. So me as religious leader or me as artistic leader show, it's about mutual respect in that way. So, you know, if at any point, you know, I see that they're not in the room, I'm like, forget it. Because that means that there's not a commitment there. So what's gonna happen, you know, down the line when there is a problem, they don't have that relationship to fall back on, and that communication will break down for sure. So that's definitely one lesson. The second one is that, you know, I mean, I can walk through all the spaces, you know, and describe them to you. You know, if we had a PowerPoint, I could show you pictures. But there's something about bringing the artist to the space and also making sure the religious leader is there when that is happening. Because there's this magical moment when the artist sees the space and reimagines it as their space and what they can do in there and the beautiful architecture that's in there. I just have to sit back and just watch it happen and watch the religious leader react to how this artist is having an actual emotion to a room, you know, that may have been mothballed, a room that maybe they only use on Wednesday nights for Bible study just because they have it. You know, so it's really about reactivating a space, and it's really kind of it's a really cool moment to kind of see that, especially if it, like I said, it does have that kind of architectural, you know, beauty to it. You know, maybe it has some stained glass, maybe it doesn't necessarily have religious inscriptions in it or anything, but it's just, you know, simple stained glass with abstractions, or nice, you know, lots of dark wood, things like that. So, I mean, I don't know if those are like lessons, but, you know, it's also just kind of, you know, just figuring out what this relationship is. And it's not about finding any match, it's about finding the right one. And it's not about like, well, I'm an artist and I want to be in this part of town, so I'm going to look for churches in that part of town, because you may not find the right congregation in that area. It might be in an area that's on the opposite side of town, and thinking about what are the possibilities over there. Maybe that's an audience that's not being served at all, you know. So those are kind of the things.
That's something about Nikki.
I just had a question about what she was saying.
Um,
Oh, do you ever find like you're talking about the spaces, two entities sharing a space and how that works out? Do you ever find like where there's a crossover on the people, where say the people in the religious community and we're like, oh gosh, I want to be part of this mind group or whatever, or conversely, people in the arts community connecting with the religious community and saying, wow, there's a spiritual hunger I have here.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that in the crossover with the individuals, the people?
Not yet.
It's
only been a couple of years, but I will say that at least in our pilot project, which was 2 theater companies inhabiting 1 church space, so they have office, rehearsal, performance, and construction space all in the same building. So, and across the hall from their main area of the church is the sanctuary. And what they noticed is that their audience members were kind of coming in and hanging out in the lobby and wanting to look in the sanctuary, but it was dark and the doors were locked. So through conversations with the pastor, they decided to, you know, well, here's the lights and here's the keys, so we'll turn on the lights and open up the sanctuary for people to look at. So it's happening in these like little tiny ways, and the congregation is actually eager to start volunteering for the different arts organizations, which the artists are really psyched for. So
yeah, I'm
so
curious.
it's starting in
Because I
smaller
felt like
ways.
if I'm looking for, like I told you when we were in the green room, like you know, if I'm looking for rehearsal space, I'll call churches or synagogues, and I find the motivation, the people behind it is like, oh, we're gonna get non-religious people on the campus? Good, maybe they'll come back. And so I find actually that kind of an interest in having people from the outside and an openness to rehearsal space and performance and
Definitely. I mean, I know for
I don't know if they ever
pretty much
do, but-
at every single site visit, I'm being recruited. And I'm like, oh, this is so beautiful. And I'm like, you can come back on Sunday, or you can come back on Friday night. You know, so there's definitely an
I
eagerness
would
there.
say that to you.
Would expect it from all of you, you on that.
Yeah, just, I love what Hiro was saying about the veranda and the in-between, and then what Susan was adding about, well, there isn't a sacred space, like this building is sacred, and yet I think that there are sanctuaries that people would say this is a sacred space. It's been set apart of where that veranda is between the holy and the mundane. Is that they would say there's something that's been set apart in this space. And I was thinking about various sacred spaces. If you can imagine any of them that you've been in, why is that a sacred space? Well, it's because this is where the story is told. This is where the story is told. Whether it's the Holy of Holies, which is the most sacred space to a Jewish or a Judeo-Christian worldview, the story is told with a piece of art. The story is told of, here's the 10 Commandments covered by the mercy seat. It's a work of art that tells a story. I was in a Coptic church in Egypt where art, the whole sanctuary is a piece of art that's meant to tell the story for those who can't read. But we have to remember so much of the world doesn't read. And so how do we enflesh the story? Is it Judeo-Christian, and I'm sure in a multitude of worldviews, it's central to faith. This Coptic church has a podium that the priest goes up to preach from, and there's 12 pillars, all made of marble. 10 of the pillars are white marble, one is gray, and one is black. The gray pillar represents Thomas, doubting Thomas, and the black pillar represents Judas. You can sit in that church and you see this foundational, and this is where the word is preached, and it's a story that's told before anybody opens their mouth. So I think that there are sacred spaces that directly connect with story. And on the flip side of that, I mentioned to you, I copied one page of notes from something that I remembered when I was in seminary, a book that was talking about the intersection of culture and faith. And just the first line of this, it's in the preface. This author says, my most recent religious experience happened in the 4th row at the closing performance of Rent. And I get choked up because I know that religious experience. I've been in theaters that have become holy because of the story that's being told. And so this thin place, this veranda between the holy and the mundane can become very thin. We can create that in a theater, and we all know those holy moments. I remember seeing War Horse, and there was a moment, if you've seen War Horse, where that horse dies, and the puppeteers get out of it, and they have their heads on the floor before they leave the stage. And the whole theater went, oh, you don't get that experience. You couldn't have put that on film. Maybe that exists in our imagination, but that communal experience of that is something that's holy. That's the transcendent. And so I think that spaces, the sacredness of space, I love the veranda of it.
You know, a couple things occurred to me. One is that, you know, these spaces already have a context that the people who come to them are living inside. And so one of the joys and challenges is how to both be true to that context and to recontextualize it simultaneously, right? Our next piece is actually traveling to different synagogues throughout LA and being performed in synagogue. And so part of the joy is to say, this is a space you're accustomed to coming to and engaging in a certain manner. And we are asking you to more deeply, or not even more deeply, but in a new way engage in a familiar setting. Two is, I'll just talk business and space here for a second, like really practical stuff. It's fascinating because producing theater has certain needs and certain, right? And because of the nature of people having day jobs and things, we might need to rehearse till midnight. And that is one of the most fascinating challenges, I think, is how to both educate our collaborators, meaning the sacred spaces, and how to be educated by them, because we can't be inflexible and neither can they. And that's been a really interesting balance to say, we actually need to be here when security is not. How do we navigate that? Like, these are just the really basic things, because in order to rehearse sometimes, or we don't get in the number of hours we need. The other interesting thing is, in a Jewish context, is Shabbat. Friday night sundown to Saturday sundown. There's, that, for the most part, that, I actually had a great conversation with an administrator who said, is there any chance of rehearsing on Saturday afternoon, And she was like, will anybody be writing anything? Probably, and so, I hope they are taking notes. What? It depends on absolutely, it depends on practice. But, so one of the things is how for us to be respectful of each other's practices is, I think, is one way to navigate the space. That can then actually inform the piece also, but I just need to put it out there because it is one of the joys and one of the great challenges.
One of the things that I'm just hearing, everybody keeps talking about story, and, which is really, I think we're talking about sort of the Exodus, and you're talking about your experience in Warhorse, and to me, that really is where God communicates to us, is through story. And even I'm thinking in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, you see where the prophets, Ezekiel was told to make a statue of the city and make faces at her, or lay down in his underwear. It's sort of like early performance art to communicate a message of God. And that's how I look at that, when you see how God chose to communicate to us, both through the scriptures, through our own creativity. And I think that that's really at the essence of where to me, faith and spirituality and art join together, and where we really meet God is in those aha moments where that story of God and of revelation connect. And so I think that's all throughout religion, it's all throughout theater, it's all throughout storytelling.
So I have so many responses to all of these things.
And even in the New Testament, Jesus spoke in parables and stories, and said, go and tell the world and take the story out there. So it's that theme is all the way through, and I think as artists that's what we do.
And that actually reminded me that same pastor of the African American Baptist Church with the dancers, as he was trying to, sell his congregation on it. He actually pulled out the Bible and pointed to something, I believe in Psalms, that, and David danced.
Right, naked.
Period. Yeah, exactly. Done. And that was his argument. With a drink in his hand. No. But that was his argument. And, we talk about access all the time. And artists needing access and what it means. And we talk about mutual respect, trying to get all these things out, all the time. What different things, we've only been touching on what's sacred to the worship sites. We're not talking about what's sacred yet to the theaters. This set, not touching anything, and these are props, and you don't touch them, and just the different areas in the church, or whatever the worship site is, and that there's also gray areas, lots of gray areas, and that's usually where most of my work happens, is in those gray areas, not in the sanctuary, which tends to be much more black and white. It's all kind of, it's fascinating to me to kind of hear these just come up, because I feel like, I know I'm not in a bubble anymore, that it's something that affects at least everybody sitting here. I don't know if I just.
So
Sure.
the reason-
Just to move us up on a little bit
Yeah.
further, so looking at the Venn diagram, right, we've talked about a lot of things that cross over between the two worlds. Certainly the idea of sort of sacred text and storytelling. And to your anecdote about your travels, looking at kind of visual metaphors. So if I can kind of throw some keywords out, I'd love to kind of prompt a slight shift in the conversation around your relationship or experience to visual metaphors, spectacle, ritual, things that, at least in my understanding, also fit in that crossover of the two worlds. Maybe we'll start there.
I think observation of approaches is fragmented for you. For my home, the architecture, there's a gate, and you walk 100 meters on the gravel bed, which is 6 feet deep. There's incredible crushness of the ground where you walk 100 meters. By the time you get into a secondary space, you've been terrified by this incredible sound of gravel pushing you up. You turned, and there we call this bent axial orientation. They're constantly bent, it's fragmented for you to, every time you bend your body, there is a marker or texture of the ground, or even the vegetation have been changed every time you bend. By the time you get to the veranda, for us, our home, 15 Venn axial orientation have created, and we call this approach and observation. A few weeks ago, I went to Japan. Narita Airport in Tokyo, stayed one night. I ride bullet train to Kyoto. When I look at my watch, it says 12:57 and 24 seconds. It's right on time. The bullet train comes in second. If you miss it, you have to wait another 7 minutes for another train. I get off the platform. My childhood friend, who's a taxi driver, the automatic door opens for me. I sat down. He asked me if I want to watch his Sony 4K plasma TV. I look at this, it's just out of the world right now. It takes about 3 hours to get to my home. I enter, I walk the gravel, I go back gate, and occasionally I see my friends, monks, father, raking the garden. Occasionally he points to the eave of our gable roof, and I see my good old friend, which is a spider. I have known this spider all my life. And I remember one day my grandfather told me these spiders have been webbing in this area from 15th century. I remember when I was a child, I asked him in an innocent voice, I said, how did you know that from 15th century? And one day he brought a scroll written by a 15th century monk, a poetry about this spider. Our monastery is about spider who masterfully crafted this web for his home, also trap. Our monastery is home, but yet same time it's a trap. I'm talking about approach and observation, same time with no conjunction. Space, there is time. In Japanese, there is no conjunction between space and time. And is a conjunction word. Japanese word, we do not use conjunction words. All are conjoined, interdependent, and approach and observation also are same. That's how I see it differently, perhaps.
Other thoughts on ritual and spectacle and visual metaphor?
I'll tell a tale. Is that in April, it was the 70th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And so we were commissioned to do a 25-minute piece during a Friday night service where normally kind of the sermon would be. And we were in often in synagogues built in a certain time. This is changing. We were talking about flexible space earlier in the back, but often there's a bima or a kind of stage up front, and it's sort of proscenium style. And we were in a particular room where the bima was very small and wouldn't allow for full performance, so we opted to set the whole room in a kind of a 3/4 extended thrust, and we were in the middle. And 25 minutes in the middle of a service, and so the performers were all seated in the congregation, and in the middle of service, an oud started playing. Actually, somebody was playing an oud.
Middle Eastern stringed instrument, just in case.
Yes, thank you. A Middle Eastern stringed instrument. Thank you. And no, it's very helpful. And the performers arose from the congregation carrying suitcases and landed in the middle and opened the suitcases and took out red fabric, and a dance began. And then we kind of went through, we actually used the structure of the steps of the Seder to tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising and going to Israel. So we were aligning a lot of things. It was shortly after Passover, so the piece was aligning, escape from bondage in Egypt, escape from, the formation of Israel, and then actually ended asking some questions about what ideals do we have? Are we living up to them? All these questions about how we are walking through the world as a people. And what was fascinating to watch was a couple things. One was that immediately, there was a lean-in. This was something new and different. But having people emerge from the congregation was the key.
Yeah.
Because what happened was, the spectacle was, you are one of us. This was the unspoken communication. Is we are not here as performers presenting something to you. We are merely illuminating and bringing to life the experience that we are all carrying with us. So that was actually, there was fabric and there was dance. I mean, I can talk about that spectacle, but the real spectacle in my mind was the emergence. And then when it ended, everyone wound up back in their seats with the congregation, and the service just continued. So that to me is a way of saying that we are part of the experience, not separate from it. And I think that can be a danger about doing performance in sacred spaces, is not being an outsider, but being an insider. So that's one example.
I think that the idea of metaphor, of saying this is that, it's not simile, this is like that, saying this is that, it's part of what theater is, and it's part of a religious experience. If you think of the sacramental nature of a religious experience, if you think of Jesus standing in front of his disciples and saying, this is my body, and he's holding a piece of bread, it's like, well, no, that's a piece of bread. No, this is my body. This is my blood. And we have these sacraments, things that we're meant, God wants us to say, yes, I want you to imaginatively make this leap and understand it in a different way. And I think that theater, in a way, informs that. We walk into this space and we say, this is an office space. No, it's not. Yes, it is. And the extent to which our brains allow ourselves to submit and give over, to allow a metaphor, whatever that metaphor might be, that it's, in terms of brain patterns, theater actually creates that. I get back to what I was saying about sacred space. Theater can help create this place by the very practice of saying, this is that. This is meant to stand for that. You're meant to look at this performer of a puppet and say, this is a horse. There's an exercise that's a spiritual exercise that theater inhabits in a very particular way, I think.
Well, I think as artists, as whether you're in the clergy or whatever, I think ultimately we want to lead people to an experience, an encounter with God, with the divine. However, we would define God maybe in a literal sense, people who are in clergy, as opposed to somebody who might, have a different interpretation of what that is. But ultimately, I think the ritual that's going to best do that is going to be different for each person and different for each artist. And so some of it's going to be maybe more formal, liturgical type of presentation, where some might just be like a moment of realism and truth that resonates with you and you're able to express that. But I ultimately think that's really the goal of both religion and theater, is to encounter the divine and to encounter God and to transcend just the mundane. So
I want to make sure that I open it up to some Q&A. I've got plenty of questions I could go for on and on, but I'm sure there's some questions that you'd like. We're going to start here.
Yes, I'm, as a non-believer who's very interested in the philosophy behind just about all religions, and I'm a critic, and I seldom see quality theater per se, a play that deals accurately with whatever the religion is, philosophy being presented. And I was thinking of J.B., the McNeish play, or even Godspell, or there's so few that deal. So I'm actually throwing this out to create a sense of the history or the ritual or whatever the religious experience is being given to us, without it becoming propaganda and hitting you over the head in the most obvious way. I don't know how that works, because I don't see it very often, and yet I'd like to see more of it, specifically theater, but also opera and dance and everything else.
I think the key, from my perspective, I've worked on a lot of material like that, and I think that the key is asking questions rather than giving answers. And I think traditionally in the church or in religious culture, I think people are trying to get a message out, and they're trying to portray something through the writing, and it comes across like propaganda. But I think that message might be more effective to be gotten out by creating material that asks questions to lead people to search for the answers. And I think that's been, so I think that maybe is where you'll see the difference between bad work and good work, if you can be, define work like that. It's all subjective, like Kim said, but.
Well, I think you get into writers as well. The ministry that we have at Bel Air Presbyterian Church, we keep saying to writers in particular, you've got more freedom than you know. But you get writers that if they're from a strong religious background, they tend to feel that they've got to serve that background as opposed to serve the story. Tell the story with the freedom that's been given you. It's trying to please the intended audience, builds a fence around you that makes that material feel small. And the material is not small, the material is infinite. And so I think it's a good point of asking questions of it and not trying to serve an audience, that you serve the story.
And I just, I think it comes back to who's the gatekeeper of the work as well. I'm thinking about, I directed and created a documentary on interfaith marriages between Jewish and non-Jewish couples, which is a very hot issue in the Jewish community. And so I was hired by an organization to do this, to create this, and I wanted to present multiple viewpoints. And I was in agreement with the organization about what the answers were and how to come to a conclusion, but I want to present all viewpoints and let people see everything. But the people who were paying for the project behind me had an agenda, and so they want everybody to have the same message. And so we actually ended up doing two versions, one that didn't have like the message of the conclusion of how they had the answer, and one that had, for their purposes, had the message of how they resolved it in God. And so I think the problem is that frequently the people who are in the gatekeeper position are not necessarily the artists and able to present it in a professional or way to provoke thought.
I think it's true that it's not dealt with enough, but then again, if you think about a lot of music, story, poetry, plays, and so many of the references to biblical stories, it's pretty incredible. Not that they're only about that, but the references, just as a body of narrative and literature that gets referenced so much in our culture. There is, I was doing a project with some artists, writers of sharing together about the Torah portion, because we do this daily exploration, weekly exploration, and having them write on the theme. This stuff was so incredible, what was coming out. And there's a project, if you're interested in looking at it, it's a newish publication that just came out, a book called Unscroll. And it's 54 artists and writers struggling with the Torah, and it's by the Torah portion. And they're not rabbis, they're not scholars. These are artists and writers struggling with the Torah portion, each weekly portion. And some of the pieces in there are really stunning, really stunning. It just came out. It's with an organization called Reboot that did this. And I used a piece in a service. It was a monologue from Judah's perspective. In that particular Torah portion. And so I agree that it's not being done enough, but this is one thing that I have seen that at least wrestling with the Torah week by, parsha by parsha, and really having, a Dr. Seuss-like poem on an eye for an eye, for example, really great. And then the binding of Isaac and then they did a performance of some of the work. They did a staged reading. It was really, there's some good stuff in there. I would say that that's one of the, and it's a new endeavor. It's just come out, and I think there is this, everybody talks about how Jewish Hollywood is, right? I mean, it's like a joke. And there are a lot of creative minds in Hollywood, and it was started by Jewish people who built Wilshire Boulevard Temple, in fact. But there is a real struggling and often a real not dealing with Jewish identity always within the writers community and actors and theater community. And I don't know if that's internalized anti-Semitism or whatever it is. It's interesting about this whole, how it gets talked about, and yet what actually gets produced is very little actual Jewish content for all the talking about how Jewish it is. But this is one piece that I think is worth looking at.
Something else, just to piggyback on what you were saying, is you use the term struggle, and I think that's the other part that I think sometimes can get left out in pieces because of either a certain sense of piety or in order for there to be drama, there must be conflict, there must be struggle. In order for there to be faith, there must be doubt. And I think that, if you read religious liturgical texts, they are filled with doubt and existential angst and the deepest, darkest moments of being in the pit. And yet often when people sit down to write a piece of drama about it, the danger is that is somehow disrespectful, when in fact it is profoundly respectful. It is actually the very thing that religion is trying to have us look at and come to grips with. And so I think that, but it still comes down to basic rules of drama. Where there is conflict, there is drama. And so I think at the end of the day, that's maybe also what I'm hearing, is that sometimes one can go to pieces that do not engage with the real, there might be moment-to-moment conflict, but the overall kind of asking the large questions and being willing to not have answers for a while in the piece. Because in a piece structurally, if the answers come in the middle or at the beginning, there might be a problem. So, yeah.
Sure, other questions?
I've been sitting here thinking how to phrase a question. So I'll just say a few things and see how you respond to it. The similarities between congregating in a house of worship and congregating in a house of art are, I think, incredibly similar. And I think what people are looking for fundamentally, aside from perhaps a glimpse or an understanding of the divine, is an understanding of human experience.
Right.
What we share and how those experiences can tell us what's this all about. Some people are comfortable with not needing an answer to that question, and others are. For me, I grew up in a religious household. I left the faith, as it were. And in large part, I was comforted by art. in all its forms. The ones where you do stuff with people and when you read on your own. To me, art has become what I would call my religion because of its ability to help us express and understand the human experience. Just one more thing I'm going to say is I don't know if anyone's familiar with a short story by Kafka called The First Sorrow. It's about 5 pages long. It's about a trapeze artist who is widely regarded as the best practitioner in his field. People come from miles around to see this person perform. He's so engaged in his art that he actually lives in the trapeze. He refuses to come down. Food is hauled up to him, other stuff is sent down, but he lives there. And every time the circus travels, the tent has to be built and the trapeze has to be built before they'll even move from the last place he was. So he has to be able to spend as little time as possible on Earth. And one of the things that strikes me about that story, it's a wonderful metaphor, or can be perceived as a metaphor for what artists do, or the role of artist in many ways similar to being a cleric. You're halfway between heaven and earth. You're somehow translating the divine into human form, and you're giving this gift to an audience to receive. I guess my larger point is the similarities between art and religion are a lot closer than many people.
Responses or thoughts?
It's a great story. There was I can't remember who told this, but it was of I think it's a true story of a tightrope walker. And the way they told the story was that, people would come from all over to see this death-defying artist, and he'd get higher and higher, and then he added this element to his act where he would start to walk down the tension wires, and to walk down the tension wires, and that this crowd would be hushed as this man now was truly defying gravity as he was walking down the tension wires. And then after a while, they realized that he'd been on the ground for 5 or 6 steps, and they were still amazed at the way he walked. And that idea of coming down and walking on this earth in such a way that people go, how does he do that? Is something that enfleshes a metaphor for a lot of people with religion as well.
I also am thinking, I really appreciated when you started this panel and you said religion and spirituality, which wasn't in the original title. Because to me, I always defined religion as something that was kind of constructed by man trying to reach God or reach divine or create some way, as opposed to a spiritual experience or relationship with God. And so I feel like as we look throughout history, you see bad religion and good religion. I mean, you literally see human beings trying to create a construct, and some of that construct takes the place of things like, the Crusades and horrific things throughout history in the name of religion. And other times we see religion where there's actually a core to it that has to do with spirituality and God and a relationship with God. And so I make a really clear divide. And, especially for me, I've shared with you a little bit about sort of my background in being Jewish and then coming to faith in Jesus as a Jewish Messiah. You can imagine with the history of the Jewish people, what religion, how offensive that was to me. And so for me, it was a lot of getting past man-made religion and taking a look at who God was and looking at the transcendent. And so I think sometimes religion can be a really bad thing. And I think I would put spirituality and relationship at the core of it, relationship with God, more than even religious structure. And so I think when the spirituality manifests itself, when the religion is a manifestation of something genuine and authentic, it's incredible. And when it's just an outward construct that has no core at the center of it, it can be horrific.
Maybe as a place to close, I tend to ask the same question with each of the panelists as we go through LA Stage Talks, and that is, what is your one wish for the LA performing arts community? in light of tonight's conversation and your experiences. And I'll have anyone start.
More funding, which we didn't talk about that, but that's like, you talk about what connects nonprofits.
Stay tuned, there's a philanthropy one in the works.
Good.
There's a weird tension in LA. I've worked as a casting director and as a talent agent. And I loved theater more in Denver than I do in LA, even though there's such a larger pool of artists here in LA. And a lot of people tend to use stage to showcase. You have an agent saying, well, who should I send? Because if you're not showcased in it, it's not gonna be worth their time. And there's a heartbreaking aspect of that, and that's what I love about people that love theater, is that it's for something so much larger than, am I gonna be showcased? And so I guess my wish for the LA theater scene is that somehow it's a huge impossible wish, but nothing is impossible with God, is that the myopic nature of actors in LA, of artists in LA, particularly actors, I guess, because they're the ones that are on stage, that somehow that would be given over into that larger experience. And a lot of times you find it, but it's not maybe where it starts.
To me, having been a part of the theater community for years in LA and then being an Ovation voter for years, I think we have the most incredible, amazing theater community, but I don't think most people outside of our community always know where to find it. And so I think I would love to see a way of, I think we've done a little bit of it with the O's. The O's are great, but I would like to see a way of being able to distinguish in the broader LA community at large the true theater versus what would be the showcase sort of self. Yeah, and I don't think people know how to find that. I think if they go to a couple of things that are like, oh, that's theater, they don't come back and they miss the gems that we have. So I would like to see us working on figuring out how to make that distinction,
Well, Bitter Lemons, if I may, bitterlemons.com is one of the ways of going to see the compilation of theatrical reviews that will often be either sweet, bittersweet, or bitter.
Right.
And it's I think, because I'm a participant of it, I find it really remarkably accurate. And it's a way of building theater if you go there.
Yeah, an aggregation of criticism,
Yes.
but
Yeah,
just
but I
for
think
those
it's
that don't know, the O's that she's referring to are Ovation Recommended, which are the voters through the Ovation Awards program saying sort of what are the top shows in that moment based on their scores relative to last year's winning scores. Other closing thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I'll try and fit two into one, is that I do think the way I might address the myopia for me is I would say a little more engagement actively with the why instead of just the how and the what. I'd like to see more engagement with the why. And also, just frankly, more rigor. I'd love to see more deeper investigation of the rigorous nature of the work as well.
I want to add to the funding piece, because I think it's about support. But the other piece of support that I think about is about folks such as yourselves and others who've been doing this for a long time, not a short time, but a long time, to have opportunities for renewal, whether that's opportunities to go on retreat or opportunities to be supported and time to just think and whatever that would look like. That folks who've been in theater in Los Angeles and working really hard for a long time have some way of having replenishment, nourishment, support, retreat, whatever that is, to support the folks who've really been in this for the long haul.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I would really love for, the artists in the room right now and anybody else who's gonna see it in the future, my wish would be for them to be inspired by what they think are obstacles and addressing them head on as a challenge and to address it in a positive way instead of a necessarily defensive way. I'm not saying that that's currently happening, but to use that as an opportunity to
to really kind of pull yourself ahead of the pack, and and there can be a dynamism in that. So.
Our final word.
There's a Sanskrit word called kappa, and it denotes this 4 feet by 17-mile long stone. And every 100 years, angel comes and swipe her silk sleeve on the top of the stone. She goes back. Another 100 years comes, swipes again, keeps swiping until the entire stone is sand off. Another story is 4 feet by 17-mile long box, wooden box, filled with poppy seeds. There's a top on it. A man comes, opens it up, takes one seed out, and put the lid on. Every 100 years, a man comes and keep doing it until it becomes empty. What she has said, in this longevity of sacrifice or discovery, I think we need to look at incredible lineage of humanity here. I come from 800-year home where if you want to study Persian art, you go to Japan of 8th century. If you want to study Tang Dynasty of China, you go to Japan because it's functioning still. We're having a performance January. We're bringing a Japanese imperial court musician. Most of the musical instruments are from Persia, but it survives. One of the oldest orchestra in the world is a living national treasure in Japan. Walt Disney Hall was built for that. Frank Gehry studied Japanese classical music in UCLA. And that amphitheater is for this classical music. I think that the word kappa, I too was raised by my parents and my monastic friends. It's time, space is conjoined.
Join me in thanking Theater of Note, our panelists, and all of you.